All right, I hope this is working. I'm typically I do my recordings in a web browser, not in PowerPoint. So hopefully you can see this. But today, everybody, we are going to talk about a subject that is critically important, unbelievably necessary, I would say, that we have a very solid understanding of. And yet, it's not very fun to talk about, but it's real life, so we have to. As teachers, you will have students. As nurses, you will have patients. As individuals going along life, you will know people who have had adverse childhood experiences. And that is the focus of today's little lesson. Um, this is not going to be complicated. I'm going to teach, and you are welcome to take notes or just to listen. It's entirely up to you what mode you would like to take this information in, but I ask that you would just be aware of your learning preferences and your learning style, and you would do what you need to in order to ensure that you can remember this. If you're going to be a teacher someday, you must understand this, okay? There's just no other way about it. If you're going to be a nurse, if you're going to be in healthcare, if you're going to be a lawyer, if you're going to be a caregiver, you need to understand adverse childhood experiences. I'm using a slideshow provided by the Kansas Children's Service League. The reason I'm using this slideshow is because I think it's the best data and slideshow all in one. And I was just making my own slideshow, and I found myself just copying these slides. I'm not going to go through every single slide. I'm going to skip through some of them that are Kansas specific or not useful for our purposes. But this slideshow is going to be how I present the information. But adverse childhood experiences. Here's what they are. An adverse childhood experience is a childhood experience of abuse, neglect, and or family dysfunction. Abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. Those are the three categories of ACEs. They have significant social, cognitive, and emotional impacts on children. And depending on the level of the abuse, neglect, or family dysfunction, there can be some severe repercussions for the student's development, the kid's development, and it leads to a necessary emphasis on wellness for a kid that supersedes the need for perhaps a classic education. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about. And what we're really finding here is that ACEs are highly deterministic, but they're not without hope, right? When I say deterministic, that's statistic language, right? I'm using the language of a researcher. We talk about highly something as highly likely or highly related to or associated with. This is what we'd call deterministic, in which there's causal studies. They're finding causation. They're finding really such a strong link with ACEs and later on effects that they're saying this actually caused this. So the ACE study goes all the way back to 1995, 1997. They're doing longitudinal studies about ACEs to this day. But let's continue. Here's why we're doing this. When you look into a kid's behavior, there's two perspectives. Let's say that you have a student or a patient or just someone in your life that is acting very inappropriately or very just developmentally not how you would like them to be. Perhaps the behavior is aggression. Perhaps the behavior is sexual. Perhaps the behavior is a cognitive thing. And you're looking at these behaviors. You have two questions that you can ask, and I encourage the second. The first question is, what's wrong with you? The second question is, what happened to you? And I would greatly urge this second question. What happened to you? See, the ACE study and the ACE studies that are currently undergoing are looking at not necessarily, they're not, they're meant to be remedial. They're meant to be helpful. They're not just looking to pinpoint bad parents. We're looking to go, what happened to our kids? What happened and how can we help? And that's the mindset of a teacher that you need to adopt. Never looking at adverse behavior and going, what's wrong? Go, what happened? Okay, it's compassion, and we need that compassion in the workforce, and we need that compassion with our teachers. So you could do a questionnaire if you would like to. I am not going to require that. I want to go through the 3 types of ACEs. We have abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, of which we have 10 total ACEs. 10 total ACEs. Okay, so within the abuse category, we have physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. Okay, this is where we're going to get to our a major understanding that you need to get when we talk about ACEs. You will notice that people use words like verbal abuse. That's not here. Okay, the term verbal abuse isn't included in the ACEs. The reason for that is because it's very hard to measure. Any ACE must be measurable, right? We're not looking at ACEs as environmental, there's just this absolutely horrible culture within the house day in and day out. We're actually looking at specific instances, specific moments in time. So physical abuse can be linked to a specific moment in time. Emotional abuse can often be linked to a specific moment in time. Sexual abuse, certainly a specific moment in time. And so when we're talking about ACEs, we're not talking about negative environments. We're talking about instances that led to a specific trauma. Okay. Next, we have neglect. Physical neglect. There's so much about this with attachment. Proper attachment with kids, and just having a physical connection with your kids, hugging your kids, loving your kids. It also has something to do, physical neglect can just be your basic needs, you guys. Physical needs, food, shelter, water, right? So it's affection. The affection kind of goes onto that emotional side too. And emotional neglect is showing an interest in your kids, showing a love for what they're doing, showing an interest in them being kids and allowing them to be kids and getting excited about what they're excited about. That shows an emotional connection. Again, we could talk about other types of neglect, but those would not necessarily be ACEs. I'll give you an example of this. We could talk about neglect in terms of time, right? You could have a neglect of time. That might be a physical neglect or something along those lines, but we are not specifying time as a type of neglect. I'll give you a quick example. I have an amazing set of in-laws, and my wife has incredible parents. Her dad, though, worked an hour away from home growing up, and he would leave at 7 in the morning before the kids were really up, and he typically wouldn't get back to 6 or 7 at night. And so he's gone, and by the time they go to bed, he's there for 2 hours a day. You could very easily go, well, he was physically neglecting them. He didn't spend enough time with his kids. But the reality was, when he got home, his whole mindset was, now I get to be with my kids. He played with them. He spent time with them. From the moment he got home and had dinner into the night, he was with his kids playing. My wife says he was gone a lot, but never once did I miss him. Never once did I feel neglected. Never once do I feel like he wasn't around enough. Because when he was around, he truly, truly cared and truly took an interest in me. You can compare that with some people who are home all the time but aren't showing an interest in their kids. That's really where the emotional neglect comes in. They're around but don't care. That's harder than not being around, but then when they are around, they do care. So again, it's not just as simple as time. Okay. Finally, we have household dysfunction. Again, these are very specific, right? Don't confuse household dysfunction ACEs with with a culture of negativity at a house or a culture of argument. Very specific. We have mental illness in the house. Okay? We have an incarcerated family member. We have a mother who is treated violently. We have substance abuse and divorce. All of these can be pinpointed to very specific moments. A mental illness can be diagnosed. An incarceration takes place at a specific time. A mother being treated violently, much like abuse, right, of a kid, it is a specific moment. Substance abuse and divorce, all specific moments. Why do I keep bringing that up? The reason we go with specifics is because ACE conversations are trying to analyze capital T trauma, not lowercase t trauma. I recently was watching a video featuring a Harvard TED Talk guy, and he was a Harvard psychologist and therapist, and he said one of the biggest things going wrong right now in modern psychology is that we have some ways as a generation of young people right now have really made trauma likable. There are several people, or not several people, there's a lot of people that make trauma out to be this thing that's almost like viewed as a positive. And so this Harvard guy was talking about how when you talk about trauma as a psychologist, you're trying to talk about these 10 specific moments that are unbelievably hard. You're not just talking about daily hardships or things that upset you. And I know that this comment might upset you, but trauma is not, oh, I got a bad grade on a test and I'm just really frustrated about it. Trauma is not, my mom didn't pay attention to me as much as I'd like her to today. Trauma is not, the teacher yelled at me. I know those can be hardships, but capital T trauma that leads to a post-traumatic stress disorder of some sort and mental illness is specifically an ACE, right? One of these 10 specific moments. I think we need to be really wise as a society and as a culture not to, I want to use my words carefully here. We need to be careful not to make things that upset us into traumas, because we live in an upsetting world. We live in a world and an environment that is sometimes difficult to navigate. And we need to be very careful with our language that the things that are hard and are hardships, and the things that are traumatic and are traumas are traumas. And we don't want to convolute those terms. It's not fair to someone who's gone through one of these 10 ACEs of trauma to then have another person using that term trauma for the coach yelling at them to run faster. Okay? I know I'm touching on some very highly debatable spaces, but I believe it's really important as a teacher as well. We don't want to popularize these terms in such a way that we are making it seem like 10 out of 10 kids have gone through 10 out of 10 ACEs, right? We don't really want to, that data is no longer useful. That data points to the world being hard. It doesn't point to kids being traumatized. So yeah, let's leave these as they are. Let's continue. When kids experience genuine ACEs, as you can see here, these 10 things, there are some really big impacts. We see behaviorally, kids that have been traumatized and have one or more adverse childhood experience typically have a lack of physical activity. They're more likely to smoke, alcoholism, drug use, missing work, all that stuff. And then we even see a lot on the physical and mental health side. There's a link between ACEs and obesity. There's a link between ACEs and diabetes. And I just think this is just shocking. They still don't know what causes diabetes. They can't. There's a lot of research going into it. And it's really unique. Diabetes certainly is not caused by adverse childhood experience. We're not deterministic here. But there is some research that suggests type 2 diabetes specifically is linked to ACEs. If there's a lurking variable there, I'm not sure. It could be the obesity, and it could be a lack of physical needs being met, going back to this neglect and physical side. But not exactly sure there. There could be a lurking variable, but yeah, that is associated. Depression, suicide, STDs. The reason for STDs, and it's not on the slideshow, a kid who's been sexually abused, this is super sad to hear, or their mother's been sexually abused, um, very frequently exhibits a higher level of sexual activity and interest at younger ages. Um, Perhaps it's a way of normalizing that. Perhaps it's a coping mechanism. There's a lot to there's a lot to wonder with it because every kid is different and every situation is different. But especially when you have kids at young ages normalizing unhealthy sexual practices, um, STDs are a side effect of that. Um, Heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, that goes to the smoking and broken bones. That probably goes to the lack of physical activity and health. So this is a recent study that they did, and just in a 30 student sample size, they found that there were 6 students in a group of 30 with no ACEs, and then it ranged all the way up to 3 kids with 6 or more ACEs. The most common population, though, is that kids have between 1 and 4 ACEs. It's very popular. 1 in 5 really, but a lot of students in this 30 kid sample had ACEs. 6 did not, right? So 1 in 5 did not have any ACEs. That meant 80% did have an ACE. Okay, so again, we are specifically talking about specific traumas, not just environments that are negative or hardships. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 8, right? So this is kind of showing a lot of people have gone through 1 of these, 2 of these, 3 of these, but yet some have 4, 5, 6, 8, right? So yeah, they're co-occurring. A lot of times if you have a household with 1 ACE, there's 2 ACEs. That they do kind of span the categories. But yeah. If you have 0 ACEs, your risk for negative health outcomes is lower. And as you go up in ACEs, your risk for negative health outcomes increases. Again, this is research that's longitudinal research, you guys. 20 years of research, 22, 23 years of research showing this year after year after year. And here's why. And this is more ed psych stuff. But when a person is experiencing consistent trauma in the home, there is a neurochemical reaction. The limbic system is a part of the brain that's composed of the hippocampus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and thalamus. Those 4 parts of the brain are serving as our processing center for really our regulation when it comes to survival, pleasure, the reinforcement of pleasure, and our memories as it regards to emotions. It connects memory and emotion in the limbic system. I'm not going to go through all of that right now. When someone is in a very healthy environment, as they get older, their brain develops such that the non-survival instincts of their brain are growing and being reinforced chemically and neurologically, so that the frontal lobe, where we're doing our executive cognition, is getting a lot more chemical reinforcement through dopamine, serotonin. If a brain is constantly in survival, it will reinforce the amygdala and the hypothalamus, which are essentially the parts of our brain that are controlling fight, fight, reflexes, just survival. Um, and long term, that state of being causes a traumatized brain to really, really focus on survival, not long term. Everything's short term. Rather than, and so just put yourself in a practical situation with this. Let's say if you have a kid in your classroom who has a traumatized brain, and their brain has been programmed to reinforce today's needs. I survived today. And you go in your English class or your math class, you're going to need this for college one day. You're going to need this 10 years down the road. That means nothing to that kid. That means absolutely nothing. A traumatized brain does not have an emphasis on long-term value. It's just that simple. The traumatized brain is, what can I do to make it through today? Survival. Okay, fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Okay, it's very, very sad to think that we have kids who are going to school and the only motivation they're given to succeed is long term, and the only thing they can think about is today. That's just not how we want to encourage people. If you are a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a clinician, whatever you're doing, and you're trying to motivate someone to make a positive behavior change, and that person's in trauma, don't give them long-term results. Give them today. How do you help them today? They will respond to that much more favorably than long-term goals. Continue. We're not going to go into the telomere erosion. That would be good, but I want to talk about this. Lifetime. We talk about adverse childhood experiences. We're talking really about the ages 0 to 12 would be the main. 0 to puberty is kind of what we're going to, and then that pubescent time is really where we start to see a lot of these outcomes. Puberty is a time when the outcomes of childhood start to amplify. You probably know that from both personal experiencing and from observing. But the adverse childhood experiences of 0 through 8 might not actually flare up and lead to negative behavior outcomes. By the time it gets 12, though, those behavior outcomes start to become more visible. Right. So if a kid was abused, perhaps at the age of 5, 6, 7, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a more aggressive 8-year-old. If they lack nurturing environment, continuing environment of neglect, perhaps it does mean around the time their puberty kicks in, testosterone levels are increasing, the fight or flight instinct is now leaning towards fight, and we get this 12-year-old that gets hyper aggressive. Okay, then fast forward, this kid's hyper aggressive, not focusing long term, focusing short term, survival, adrenaline based, testosterone based decisions. They're missing a lot of school. They're getting in a lot of altercations with other kids. There's going to be a social impairment, an emotional impairment, and a cognitive. They're missing school. They're having difficult relationships with classmates. They're feeling very lonely, right? You can think of a kind of this lonely middle schooler that's just struggling with so much aggression. Eventually, that does typically lead to some health risks and behaviors. The most obvious low-hanging fruit for an exemplar here would be like a gang. When we get kids who are in high-risk, negative social-emotional environments who've experienced ACEs, by the time they get to high school, there's a sort of grouping and finding of one another in high-risk behavior areas. So you're ending up with your kids who have their sort of, what's the word I want? They unite through poor behavior or health risk behavior. What's the term? Solidarity. They're finding their solidarity with health risk behaviors. That obviously is the disease, injury, disability, and the ultimate outcome is early death. If someone has 6 or more ACEs, their life expectancy is 20 years shorter, and there's an economic toll. The CDC estimates that child maltreatment costs our country $124 billion throughout the lifetime of a kid each year. So we have healthcare, we have productivity loss, we have welfare, we have criminal justice, we have special ed, all of these things. Not all special ed is ACE related, by the way. That's super important to point out as a teacher. There is ACE related special ed. It'd be a little bit different than a learning disability, though. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. We're not going to look at the Kansas data, but we really need to focus on strategies. First and foremost, we want to have strategies to prevent ACEs, right? We want to have strategies to teach healthy families. We want to teach healthy families that to function in ways to bringing up children in low-risk environments. But that's not reality currently, so we want to, as teachers, we need to focus on our protective factors. This is you're going to be your assignment, by the way. We have resilience to stress, social connections, child development knowledge, concrete supports, and parent-child attachment. These are 5 areas that we really, really want teachers to get good at. We need to help our kids learn resilience to stress. Look me in the eye here. Teaching resilience does not mean talking about resilience at kids. Please hear that. Teaching resilience does not mean shoving resilience studies and growth mindset down kids' throats. How do you teach resilience? You have to model it. You have to help it. It's slow. No one learned resilience from a lesson plan. You learn resilience through being given care, example, and help. Social connections. We have to help kids find positive social connections. If they've experienced ACEs, the research shows that they're at a higher risk for negative social connections. So, as teachers, caregivers, caretakers, we have to help kids find positive social connections. Child development knowledge. There is nothing wrong with teaching a middle school student about this stuff. In fact, they'd appreciate it. They would appreciate it. There's nothing wrong with teaching adults or parents about this stuff. We need a greater understanding of child development knowledge if we're going to take this down at the root level. Concrete supports. Concrete means it's not going anywhere. Supports means it's helping in a positive way. And crisis means it's during when they need it the most. So we need something that's always there to help kids when they need it most. That can be at school, that can be clinically, that can be in a variety of different places, but it needs to be there. And then ultimately, we really need to find ways to help parents and children reattach. And I mean that medically, not just an emotional attachment like a clinginess. Attachment's referring to this close love, compassion, mindset, care. So that's something we really need to focus on. What I want you to do now, here's what we're going to do for your assignment. Starting this week, finishing next week, you need to pick one of these. And we're going to write a paper on it. Not a paper. It could be up to you. I'm going to give you a choice board. There's going to be a choice board, and I'll put an assignment description up to give you more direction on this. But I want you to pick one of the 5 protective factors. And I want you to research it thoroughly. Don't just find what the CDC says. Don't just find what the NIH says, even though I really like NIH sources, by the way. But find a variety of sources and probe, dig deep, right? Let me give you an example. Resilience to stress, you could research, and you'd find all kinds of studies right away. The best studies are going to be longitudinal studies with controlled outcomes. And I know that sounds like a lot of research and stats language, but what I mean is an anecdote. Like one person's experience teaching resilience and seeing an outcome does not mean great results or great repeatable results. Okay? Growth mindset is going to be the first thing that comes up, and I would press against growth mindset a little bit. shoving things down kids' throats, making them do long-term goals in the midst of a brain that can't handle long-term goal setting, really is to me just like this creepy invention to make money. But that's my opinion. You can form your own. Social connections, child development knowledge, concrete supports in crisis. Some of these have a little bit of a political strain on them right now. Try to get on both sides, right? Concrete supports in crisis is highly debated. It's a political topic right now. And I would really urge you to look at both sides of the political spectrum. You're going to look at both sides, and then you'll have a choice for how you want to present the information. I'm going to make the choice board and put it on Moodle. You have 2 weeks to do this. Shouldn't be too hard, shouldn't be like a crazy difficult assignment, but please dig hard and do your work up front. I want to see that you look at both sides. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about. We'll go through some of this next stuff later, but I want you to start doing some on your own. And that's a little bit about ACEs, and I hope it helps your understanding of why this is so important and why we talk about it. All right, let me close my slide. Oh, there's the PowerPoint.